Act 1. Cold open. A windowless room. A bare metal table. A sealed manila envelope on the table. A sketch pad. A pencil. A clock on the wall reading 2:14 in the morning. A man in a folding chair, eyes closed, breathing slowly, asked to draw what he could not see. This is not a seance. There is no incense, there is no medium. There is a typed praebutal on a clipboard and a stenographer in a side room. And there is a budget line somewhere in Langley that pays for the lights overhead. For 23 years, the United States government paid people to do this. This is the file on the program they called Stargate. Act 2. The Record. The work began in 1972, in a laboratory in Menlo Park, California, at an institute then called Stanford Research Institute, and now known as SRI International. Two physicists, Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff, were experimenting with what they called remote viewing, the claimed ability of a subject to describe a distant location, person, or object without using ordinary senses. Their first paying client was a charitable foundation. Their second client was the Central Intelligence Agency. The Cold War was, among other things, a market for unusual ideas. The CIA had heard rumors that the Soviets were running similar programs. The agency was unwilling to leave that ground unoccupied. The first subject of public record was a New York artist named Ingo Swann. The second was a former police commissioner from Burbank named Pat Price. Both produced sketches and descriptions of distant sites that, according to Targ and Puthoff, contained details the men should not have known. By the late 1970s, the program had grown. It had been split among several intelligence agencies. The Central Intelligence Agency funded the research wing. The Defense Intelligence Agency took over operational direction. A small viewing unit was attached to U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, INSCOM, at Fort Meade in Maryland. The umbrella name changed several times: Gondola Wish, Gruel Flame, Centerlane, Sunstreak, and was finally consolidated under the codename Stargate Project in 1991. By the time it closed, the program had spent, by most published estimates, around $20 million across roughly 2 decades. Act 3. The Anomaly. The operational unit at Fort Meade was small, 6 to 9 viewers at any one time. Their cases came in by sealed packet from intelligence customers across the government. The unit's most decorated viewer was a U.S. Army officer named Joe McMoneagle. He had been brought in after a near-death experience he attributed to a brain hemorrhage in West Germany. He stayed with the program longer than anyone else. He was awarded the Legion of Merit on his retirement, with a citation that pointed, in part, to his work in the unit. The cases the participants still cite are the ones that lived in the unit's institutional memory. There was a Soviet submarine. The unit was reportedly tasked in the late 1970s with describing a class of submarine then under construction at a Soviet shipyard. A viewer is said to have produced a sketch of an unusually large vessel, well in advance of Western confirmation that the Soviets were building what would become the Typhoon class.
There were the American hostages in Tehran. After the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in 1979, viewers were tasked with describing the hostages' locations and conditions. Some of those sessions produced descriptions that the unit considered useful. There was a downed Soviet bomber somewhere in the African bush that President Carter is said to have credited a remote viewer with helping to locate. For every one of those, however, the file contains a wider drawer of misses: sessions that produce nothing, sessions that produce descriptions that did not match the target, sessions that produced descriptions so generic they could have matched almost any place. The viewers themselves, in interviews given decades later, did not claim infallibility. McMoneagle, in particular, has been consistent in saying that remote viewing is at best a hit-or-miss instrument, never a substitute for ordinary intelligence. The intelligence customers, by the late 1980s, were starting to agree. The problem was not that the unit failed every task. The problem was the shape of its successes. A useful intelligence tool produces information that is specific, timely, and falsifiable. A viewer who described the inside of a Soviet research facility in terms of metal pipes, low ceilings, and the smell of fuel was producing a description that could fit several dozen Soviet research facilities, and that could not be acted on without conventional confirmation. By the time conventional confirmation arrived, the remote viewing session was no longer the source of the intelligence. It was an interesting footnote to it. That is how a program of this kind dies. Not by being exposed, by being quietly rendered redundant. Act 4. The Investigation. In 1995, the CIA, having taken back custody of the program, commissioned an outside review. It was conducted by the American Institutes for Research, a nonprofit research organization based in Washington. The review was led by 2 reviewers chosen for their disciplines and their disagreement. Jessica Utz was a professor of statistics at the University of California. She was open to the possibility that the data showed something real. Ray Hyman was a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. He was a longtime skeptic of parapsychological claims and a founding figure of CSICOP, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. They were given access to the program's data and to its operational record. They wrote separate appendices. Utz concluded that the laboratory data showed a small but statistically significant effect, in her view too consistent to be dismissed as chance and worthy of further investigation. Hyman concluded that the experimental protocols were not tight enough to rule out conventional explanations, sensory leakage, judging artifacts, statistical opportunism, and that even where positive results appeared, they were not specific enough to be operationally useful. Both reviewers, however, agreed on the bottom line. The program had not produced intelligence that was demonstrably useful to its customers. It had not produced a result that any other laboratory could replicate. That was the finding the agency needed.
It was not the finding the participants had hoped for. Most of them, then and now, have been honest about the disappointment. The viewers had spent their careers in a windowless room. The physicists had spent 2 decades arguing for a phenomenon they believed existed. The customers had spent $20 million expecting something they could put on a desk in front of a director and defend with a straight face. The Utz and Hyman appendices, between them, took that defense apart. The CIA closed the Stargate project that same year. The viewers were released. The unit at Fort Meade was disbanded. The contracts at SRI and at its successor laboratory at Science Applications International Corporation were not renewed. Act 5. The Silence. What was not destroyed was filed. Stargate's records were classified for years and then released in stages. A large public release came in 2017, when the CIA opened a substantial portion of its CREST archive to the public. Researchers, journalists, and curious civilians were able, for the first time, to read the session transcripts, the sketches, the targets, the notes. What is in the file is what you would expect from 23 years of patient government work, and what you would not. There are sessions in which a viewer produces a description so close to the target site that the page raises the hair on the back of your neck. There are sessions in which the viewer produces nothing. There are sessions in which the viewer produces something that is judged a hit by enthusiasts and a miss by skeptics, and the page itself does not settle the argument. There is no sealed transcript that says, "This is the day remote viewing was proven." There is no sealed transcript that says, "This is the day it was proven a fraud." There is instead a long record of careful people trying very hard to measure something they could not measure cleanly, and admitting, in the end, that they could not. A few of the viewers wrote memoirs. Joe McMoneagle has written several books. David Morehouse wrote one. Some of the others have spoken in documentaries. Some have not spoken at all. Outside the US, similar programs are believed to have run in the Soviet Union, in China, and in a smaller form in the United Kingdom. Their records are less open. Where they have surfaced, they tell a similar story. Real budgets, real subjects, real sessions, no replicable result. That is the cleanest summary the file allows. The sessions themselves, read 3 decades later, are the strangest part of the archive, not because of any single hit, because of the texture of them. A trained subject in a quiet room, breathing slowly, describing impressions of a place chosen at random by someone in another building. A monitor reading a structured protocol. A tape recorder catching the silences. The transcripts read in places like prose poems. In other places, they read like the notes of a tired man trying to do an honest day's work. They are not on the page the records of charlatans. They are the records of people who believed they might be doing something real, who agreed to be measured, and who did not falsify the misses to protect the hits. That institutional honesty, paradoxically, is the strongest argument the program ever made, not for remote viewing, for its own seriousness. Act 6. The archivists close.
23 years, $20 million, several hundred sessions in a windowless room at Fort Meade. No replicable scientific demonstration that would convince a skeptic. The honest reading is not that the United States government found something it could not explain and hid it. The honest reading is that the United States government tried very hard to find something, did not find it on terms anyone could check, and had the institutional honesty to close the file. The room is still there, on no one's tour. The lamp is off. If the unfinished histories haunt you the way they haunt me, there is another file on the desk. The lamp is still lit.